Good day, everyone, and welcome to RSA Conference 2021, Session ID SATW11, Strengthening Resilience of Position Navigation and Timing Services. My name is Jim McCarthy, and I'm a Senior Security Engineer at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, and I'm accompanied by my colleague, Jim Platt, the Chief of Strategic Defense Initiatives at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency, or CISA. We want to take the opportunity to thank RSA for allowing us to convey this message to the public, which we believe is an important one. There's an executive order that's backing up all of the federal government efforts that are taking place in this area. So strengthening resilience of position navigation and timing services, or increasing the responsible use of position navigation and timing services, is based off an executive order that came out about a year ago. We're going to do this presentation in two parts. First, Jim Platt is going to be walking through a high-level overview of the threat environment regarding PNT, some of the actions that government's already taking, and then finally, I will come in later and talk about a specific document or specific efforts that are in the executive order that are provided to the public to reduce the risk of any disruption or manipulation of PNT services. Jim, thanks a lot, and go ahead, please.
Thanks, Jim. Appreciate the introduction there. And some of you may be wondering what the problem is with position navigation and timing and why we would need an executive order. Well, there was recently an article within the Wall Street Journal that talked about America having a GPS problem. And it's not that the GPS has a problem, it's the problem that the US and the world, tell the truth, has a problem over dependence of GPS. So what we'd like to do is talk about that overdependence of GPS and PNT services, how it's become integrated within our critical infrastructure, and steps that you can take to help us address this problem. As Jim mentioned, back in February 12th of 2020, President Trump signed an executive order, number 13905, which is strengthening the resilience of U.S. critical infrastructure through the responsible use of position navigation and timing services. And the idea here was that we would promote a responsible use of PNT services. And I'll get into that in just a second about what a responsible use of PNT services is. And in many cases, it's much easier to demonstrate what an irresponsible use of position navigation and timing services is. And the idea behind this is, should we lose position and navigation and timing services provided by GPS or other global navigational satellite systems, that there would be a minimal impact to U.S. critical infrastructure. A 2018 study by the Department of Commerce indicated that the loss of GPS could have a $1 billion a day impact on the U.S. economy. So the focus of this executive order is really on critical infrastructure, but as we know, our critical infrastructure is becoming more and more digitized every day. And that is why we're here talking today to the people in RSA, because we believe this is a security problem that needs to be addressed moving into the future. So why now? Why GPS or why PNT and why now? If you take a look on the screen, you see just some of the applications that use position navigation and timing services. And many people don't even realize that they are using them on a daily basis. On the left-hand side, we have things that everybody's pretty familiar with position navigation and timing. You see people out surveying with GPS devices. We have our national airspace that is being controlled by GPS and other position and navigation services. And also everybody's familiar with the GPS on their phone or the navigation system they have in their car. But hidden below that, in many cases, are more discrete uses of position navigation and timing. And they can be found in things like the power grid, where we have synchrophasers, which are monitoring the states of the grid and are feeding systems that will automate how the grid is operated. Within precision agriculture, nowadays we have autonomous vehicles moving through the field, and these vehicles, using data provided by the global positioning system and other augmentations, can actually get about 4-centimeter pass-by-pass augmentations. Should we lose GPS and its augmentation systems, we may not be able to produce farming at the levels that we do today. And then, highly important to those out there, especially those of us who can't put our phone down, the telecommunication system is highly dependent on GPS for keeping synchronized and allowing the throughput of data in the limited spectrums that we have. Estimates that we completed in 2019 show that should we lose GPS, our cellular communication networks would begin to degrade almost immediately. Within about 8 hours, we would see the cellular network going into islanding mode. In other words, you could talk on your phones, but you won't be able to drive down the road and talk on your phone. We would see decreased bandwidth, so you may not be able to watch movies or videos. And then after several weeks, we would actually lose the ability to use our cellular networks. So throughout critical infrastructure, there are these uses with position, navigation, and timing that needs to be addressed as we become a more digitized society. And then on the right-hand side are just some additional things that you can see, everything from our financial markets to drilling in the seas for oil exploration, and even some of our space-based systems use GPS to maintain their orbits. As we move forward, it is important that we understand when these systems use position and navigation and timing services. And you would think that may be obvious, but as GPS emerged over the past 20 to 30 years, what we saw take place was everybody was marveled at the capabilities of GPS, and GPS receivers were viewed as radios. So they weren't designed and built with the security and resilience built into them. And what we see now is that these GPS receivers are becoming more and more like computers, and therefore we need to design our systems to address the same cybersecurity risk that we find in our everyday IT networks. So a little bit about the GNSS systems and global navigational satellite systems. These systems broadcast a very weak signal. When you get the signal from GPS, it's actually under 1 billionth of a watt. To put that in perspective, it's like taking a 20-watt light bulb, lighting it on the East Coast, and then trying to see it in the middle of the day from the West Coast. So because this signal is so weak, and because the GPS signal is an open signal and the US Air Force publishes exactly what that signal structure is, it is very easy to jam the GPS signal. It can be done with a $30 jammer. I would encourage you not to do that. It's illegal to do such. But in recent years, something that used to be the purview of a nation state, you can actually replace the GPS signal with a $200 software-defined radio and software that you can download over GitHub. So as GPS is becoming more and more integrated into our critical infrastructure systems, it's becoming easier and easier to not only disrupt GPS through a denial of service attack, but also to put a man-in-the-middle attack where you can disrupt and replace the GPS signal getting to your system. What we are really pushing with this responsible use is we should never design critical infrastructure systems in such a way that if we are using GPS or any other position, navigation, and timing services that is not coming from an authenticated source, you should always do validity checks to ensure that the signal you're getting is coming from a trusted location and that signal is valid. And if either of those conditions does not exist, that your system behaves in a predetermined and expected way. If you fail to do this, we have actually seen situations in critical infrastructure now where false signals are introduced and erratic behavior takes place that was not expected. And I'll cover just a few of those in the next couple of slides. A cautionary tale in the Black Sea. Several years ago, a ship's captain, you see the ship here, was traversing the Black Sea. And suddenly his ship started traveling at speeds beyond which it was capable. At least that's what his instrument panel was reporting. It was also reporting that his ship was traveling below the surface. As you can see here, it's not a submarine. And then lastly, his ship jumped miles inland to an airport. And the captain simply did not know what was going wrong. Fortunately, it was the time of the day where the captain recognized that his ship can't travel that way. It can't jump inland. So the captain was able to continue navigating using visual aids. Imagine the same scenario where those jumps were not as dramatic, but simply wandered that vehicle off course. And if they were in more enclosed water spaces, the ship could have been run aground, or it could have been diverted to an area that would make it susceptible to a pirate or some other type of interventions on the high seas. But it is important here that the captain recognized that there were many other things, position and navigation aids available for them to understand their situational awareness. And when GPS was presenting false data, they were able to adjust and ensure that they were able to stay on course, that they were the course that they were predetermined to take. And it's not just a matter of if somebody is broadcasting a bad signal. We all know that if you have an IT device that sometimes is going to give you a bad behave in an erratic manner. Well, back on April of 2019, the GPS system tracks its months its week numbers in a 10-bit register. So every 19.7 years, this 10-bit register rolls over from 10 ones to 10 zeros. We knew this was coming 19 years in advance. And despite that fact, across the globe, when this event took place, some GPS systems failed to operate or began to put out false data. This should not have happened. If the systems were properly designed, it should have rolled over. And if the system didn't handle it, it should have passed data into the supported system, and the supported system should have handled it appropriately. And as an example of a supported system not handling it appropriately, there were jumbo jetliners on the ground in China when this took place. Those jumbo jetliners, when they booted back up, the GPS receiver reported bad data, and those jumbo jetliners remained grounded for approximately 7 to 10 days before the system could be restored. So it's not just a matter of getting bad position, navigation, timing data because the GPS signal was interrupted. There's always those technical issues that can take place. And what we are trying to ensure designers of critical infrastructure systems do is design their systems in such a way that if the PNT receivers you have, for whatever reason, passes bad data into your system, the system is able to recognize that bad data and happen accordingly, or maintain operations in a manner that you have predicted. And you think, well, that's pretty simple to do. But even the most complex systems have issues with this. And when I say the most complex systems, I talk about human beings. This is not an uncommon occurrence. What you see here is actually the Georgetown Canal in DC. A driver was driving along with relatively good visibility. The GPS device on the dashboard was apparently malfunctioning and told the driver to turn right. And without even thinking, the driver turned right, drove the vehicle into the canal, and the driver had to be rescued by fire and emergency services. Why I bring this up is just to explain the concept that even though a human had all these other sensory and situational awareness cues available to them, they still ignored them and followed GPS and drove the vehicle into the canal. So as you are designing systems that are receiving external PNT sources, it's important that you consider the fact that whether it be through intentional means, such as we saw in the Black Sea, through errant equipment, such as we saw with the GPS rollover, or simply some anomalous behavior that we don't know why it took place, that the supporting system must always assess the data that is coming in and be programmed to react accordingly if that data is not trustworthy. So this brings us back full circle. I've just explained that last example was an example of what irresponsible use of position, navigation, and timing is. It's when you've received bad data or data that does not make sense, and the system that receives it takes that information, operates in the way that it was designed, but the way that it was designed was not thought through or was designed with the concepts that the input data would always be correct or always be available. As you move forward with this, we ask that you look at your critical systems that use position, navigation, and timing data. You understand what the source of that data is, and then you design your systems in such a way that if that data is ever corrupted or is unavailable, your systems will continue to behave in a way that you deem acceptable until true position and navigation and timing services can be restored. So what we want to do here is not just tell you that's what you should do. What we've done is worked with the National Institutes of Science and Technology to develop something called the PNT profile that will help you define what the problem is and develop mitigation strategies. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jim.
Thanks a lot, Jim, for providing that excellent overview. And we're looking at the exact title of the document. Again, this was born of the Executive Order 13905 effort to provide guidance to both the public and private sector on how to increase the resilience of PNT services. NIST-IR, or NIST Interagency Report 8323, Foundational PNT Profile Applying the Cybersecurity Framework for the Responsible Use of Position, Navigation, and Timing, or PNT Services. There's a lot packed into that title. And what I'll do over the next couple of slides is unpack it and help everyone gain an understanding in terms of assessing their own risk in their own environments at the organizational level, sector level, or subsector level to properly mitigate against potential disruptions and manipulations of P&T services. Excuse me. So jumping into it, again, I'm going to defer back to the executive order. The whole purpose of the profile, aside from increasing overall awareness, it's easy to say that perhaps there's a part of the user segment out there, users of P&T services, who may be unaware of the fact that they are depending on timing signals. And I'm using timing as a key example here because many folks can relate to that, timing for systems in particular. The first objective here was to allow for people to be able to identify systems dependent upon P&T, identify appropriate P&T sources. Now, whether your system is receiving original signals or not, it's going to be important to be able to identify if your system is part of a hierarchy or it's receiving GPS or GNSS signals from other systems in the hierarchy. This is a rather important point to pay attention to. The ability to detect disturbances and manipulation of P&T services, and finally manage the risk to these systems. Again, this traces directly back to the executive order. So what do we do in terms of being able to address or providing for users, end users in the stakeholder community, and this is all users of P&T for that matter, is we use a methodical approach to it. So based on the cybersecurity framework, which I'll talk here in just a second, but in terms of the overall development process itself, it's important to mention that this whole process that we undertook to create this cybersecurity framework-based profile was open, transparent, and collaborative. I believe we had at least 75 to 80 collaborators from government, academia, the private sector, even individuals offering us information on how they go about mitigating risks in their P&T environment. Of course, Jim mentioned he was one of them, a major one, in fact, in terms of helping us get this profile turned out. So the primary stakeholders in this case are everyone who uses P&T, as I already mentioned. The focus is on critical infrastructure. That is specifically stated in the executive order. Why is this? Because we're so heavily dependent upon it. So the key point here, again, going back to one of the purposes, overall higher purposes of the executive order, is to increase the awareness that systems out there may be using P&T, whether you know it or not. It's so ubiquitously used and widespread that users may just take it for granted that they may not be receiving any direct timing signals, either from an original source or from a system that's upstream from them. So it's important to have that understanding and awareness primarily. And then, of course, leveraging the NIST cybersecurity framework. If you look over to the right, those 5 items are the core functions of the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is what we're basing the profile on. And again, be patient here because I'll walk through this so that everyone gets an understanding. So giving some prerequisite background on identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. These are all elements of cybersecurity. Moving on, in terms of how we develop the profile, we take through our outreach and engagement efforts with the private and public sectors, we issued a request for information in May of 2020, excuse me. And all that input was used to derive information about how to properly mitigate or address the responsible use of P&T services. So you have cybersecurity requirements, business and mission objectives, understanding of the technical environment, whether organizationally or within a sector. Those inputs go into the cybersecurity framework, into something called subcategories, of which there are 108 of them. We used only about 80 of them for this particular profile. And what is the outcome? These are methods by which to identify systems, networks, and assets dependent upon P&T services. I mentioned already, identify appropriate P&T services or sources, as that should say, detect disruption and manipulation of P&T services, and manage the associated risks. So sounding a little redundant here, but I want to drive home the point that this was a careful approach in terms of how the outputs were obtained in order to provide the document that we have. So it's a completely free document. It's not mandatory, but has no regulations attached to it. It's a purely voluntary document should you feel the need to be able to mitigate against the risks associated in these P&T environments. The content of the profile itself. Now we're actually looking at a snippet of what you will see if you decide to undertake a more deeper investigation into the profile. And mind you, this is not exclusively what the document contains, but this is the core part of it, I should say. There's some front matter, which explains our rationale, our approach, our scope, our objectives, things of that nature. But this is really where a lot of the grind or the hard work took place in terms of producing this particular output. So as I mentioned, deferring back now to the cybersecurity framework, these categories over to the left, the function here in this case is identify. The category is asset management. The subcategory ID in this case is AM1, and this CSF language is taken directly from the cybersecurity framework. Physical devices and systems within the organization or inventory. This is very simple language oriented towards cybersecurity. The middle column, as I mentioned, is the original work that was done on this particular profile. So you're profiling a realm or an arena. In this case, it's PNT, and you're getting all the information, or we will have obtained all the information from our outreach and engagement efforts, the RFI, our conferences or webinars, gleaning all this information from the user base and basically putting the most important components here. So it gives a logical breakdown of the things, in this case, that you'll need to pay attention to in the P&T environment in regards to asset management. Equally as important over to the right, when you look at the references, those were gotten from our interaction, or I should say engagement and outreach efforts with the private sector and everyone else who participated with us to provide possible mitigations. Again, this document does not specifically recommend any particular mitigation. It's all going to depend on the environment, your own organization, or your own assessment of your risk, which the cybersecurity framework provides for, to be able to come up with mitigations that you choose. There's really no right or wrong answer. It's basically what is appropriate to your environment. And that's perhaps the most important point in terms of implementing this profile, again, at the organizational level, at the sector or subsector level. And I want to emphasize that because there are some plans in the works to develop these for at the sector level in various sectors because they're so heavily embedded in critical infrastructure, and of which the importance cannot be understated. Moving on, in terms of applying what you have learned today, if you want to undertake a serious or more deliberate investigation of your own risks or the threat environment in terms of your own P&T use, you can read the NIST Foundational Profile for P&T Services. We've got some websites at the end here to give you, or you can click on and go find it on the NIST website and in several other areas. So that would be the first recommendation. Just read it, see if it's appropriate or if it applies to you. How heavily dependent on P&T services are you? Can you figure that out? These are really important components for you to consider if you wanted to do a deeper investigation. Within the first 3 months following the presentation, consider inventorying all your systems and devices that are dependent upon P&T data. Take it a step further, identify your sources. So you may not be an initial recipient of a GPS or GNSS signal out there. Can you identify the source of your timing for your systems in particular? And again, I keep deferring to this timing. This does include position and navigation as well, but timing is the easiest example to provide to you folks, just as an example of the measures you can undertake. Now, consider also, if you believe in your investigation that you have an above average level of dependency on P&T services whereby a disruption or manipulation could cause you some downtime, not only to yourself and your own operations, but folks who are downstream or dependent upon your services, you may wish to incorporate alternative P&T or timing sources into your architecture. This could be another source of GPS or GNSS signaling, or it could be, and this is what I'm about to mention here, that's highlighted, NIST time over fiber resources, another alternative to get time without using P&T based signaling. So there's an alternative out there. I'm not saying you have to use NIST time over fiber resource here, but it is important to remember, if you decide to move away in terms of a failover from GPS, GNSS related systems, then there are alternatives hardwired, let's say. Within 6 months, consider if you're continuing to pursue this, identifying the vulnerabilities, threats, and potential impacts should threats be realized in terms of assessing your overall risk to PNT disruptions or manipulations, implementing procedures. If you find that, yeah, I could very well be vulnerable if this goes down or if my services are disrupted, then consider implementing procedures. Again, the profile walks you through these steps methodically. And then finally, we're assuming here that there are policies and procedures in place, at least at the organizational level, in terms of cybersecurity. You may wish to augment your cybersecurity policies and procedures to include a specific mention of PNT services, which would be a great idea if you find that you are a more sophisticated or more elevated user in the space that we're dealing with here. So with that being said, just a quick summary of all the things we talked about today, getting to the overall point. The use of PNT data or services in your organization may not be obvious. Again, going right back to the executive order here, our job was to increase awareness that you may be using this without even knowing it. And we're hoping you can assess your ultimately the amount of dependency you have on PNT services. Understanding the risks posed by dependency is great. So if you can understand the risk, then you might want to take measures in order to prevent against serious disruption or manipulation, particularly if you are in the critical infrastructure space. And then finally, and obviously, the NIST PNT profile can help organizations provide PNT-related cybersecurity measures. As I mentioned prior, below are references. That NIST homepage there is the homepage for PNT. Not only will you be able to get the PNT profile downloaded from there, but you'll find a lot of resources that we've provided at their previous webinars explaining the whole process we undertook to develop the profile, et cetera. And over to the right, Jim's homepage at CISA there, www.cisa.gov/PNT. A lot of excellent supplemental information on some of the mitigations, some of the documentation that CISA is producing in this space. So with that, we'd like to thank you for your time and attention here. And Jim, any last words here to add?
Jim, thanks a lot for that great rundown of the PNT profiles and the great work done by NIST. And to close out, I'd just like to say, as we're moving forward, and our society is becoming more integrated, more automated, position and navigation timing services are going to become even more prevalent. And as we are developing those systems, it's always important for us to understand what PNT services we're using, what risk and which benefits they deliver, and then have a well-informed risk-based practice to implement those in your system, and that we do no longer design systems in such a way that we just assume position navigation and timing services will always be accurate or will always be there. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.